Hello and welcome to the Dissidents podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Elizabeth Spivak and Mike Burke look at how individuals overestimate the potential of harmful information. Hello everybody, welcome. So today we are looking at another article that relates to, this time, harm hypervigilance in public reactions to scientific evidence. So, Elizabeth, what are they talking about here?
Well, this is it's a psychological science article. So this is the one that fired the editor. This is the journal that fired the editor for doing the publish. Well, he was going to publish a DEI article with responses, and everybody had a fit, which is interesting because everybody had a fit because it was harmful, right? Everybody had a fit because it was harmful to publish this article and have responses that might be critical of an article that was about DEI issues. And so here we have an article published in that same journal on harm hypervigilance in public reactions to scientific evidence. And it's the authors are some heavy hitters. We have Alana Redstone, who's, by the way, at Heterodox, and Philip Tetlock.
Needs no introduction.
Yeah. So what they did is actually fairly simple. I mean, they asked people, about 1,500 people in a couple of studies. Roughly 2/3 of them were assigned to just rate some 6 different research articles on how if this research article was published, do you think that it would be helpful to publish it? Things like, do you think it would be harmful? Different versions of helpful, harmful. There should be more research. That they would try to thwart the research practices. So pretty simple hypothesis was that people would be more supportive of the research than the other participants would think they would be. So we have participants who are rating the research for their helpfulness and the harmfulness of potential harm that this research might do. So if something about, for example, one of them was that women who are mentored by women are less successful. Okay, so that could be considered harmful, and most of these were real articles and a couple of them had been retracted for one of them was on police, that there was actually not bias in police responses to Black people in various calls. Same-sex parent findings, which was that same-sex parents are their children are no worse off than opposite-sex parents. Christian prejudice findings, which was that activating Christian concepts increases racial prejudice, and so those were meant to be sort of potentially offensive to conservatives, right?
The one that really struck me was the meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin that found that the effects of child sexual abuse were not intensely or universally negative.
Right. Yeah.
And you can see how that one would offend.
Right. So that was expected to be essentially offensive to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the conservative ones, was expected to be offensive to conservatives. That one, and a fabricated one that were expected to be offensive to everyone. And then the ones that were expected to be offensive to liberals was the women mentors one, and the police discrimination findings, that absence of racial discrimination against ethnic minorities. So we have potentially research that should be offensive to any participant. That join our study, was the idea. And then they asked people a series of questions about how harmful and helpful these research studies might be. Now, and again, overwhelmingly, they found time and time again that the actual harmfulness that, again, 2/3 of the people rated the actual harmfulness and actual helpfulness. Over and over again, the actual harmfulness was rated much lower than the alternative condition, where participants rated how harmful they thought other people would think the research would be. So, and again, it's and then the opposite was true of helpfulness, right? That people rated the actual helpfulness of all of these studies higher than the participants who were supposed to rate how other people would expect, the helpfulness rating to be. So, again, pretty simple findings. It was what they expected. One thing they didn't find that they expected to find was that women would think that it was more research was more harmful. They found it in study 1. No, they found it in study 2, but not in study 1. Now, one thing I will say, which I find this, I mean, you're not a statistician, so it's not going to probably didn't stand out to you,
No.
but this really shocked me. So in the results section of the first study, they say, first paragraph, following our pre-registration, we tested harm hypervigilance using 30 single sample t-tests. Now, that is a big no-no. That is a big no-no in research. Now, it may be that they did not mention what they should have done was adjust their alpha for, when they did this. I just can't tell you how much of a no-no this is just bad science. So what happens is that every time you do a test, you always accept a certain margin of error. Okay, so you might find a statistically significant result that is in error. Okay, and so we always this is why in science we especially psychology, we never say prove, because we always know that there's a possibility that we made error. And in fact, we set the error rate that we're willing to accept. Sometimes 5%, sometimes 1%. Every time you do another test, you challenge that alpha, or that error rate that we set. So every time we do a test, that we are actually statistically increasing the possibility that we will find a statistically significant result that is in error.
Okay.
So doing 30, not just in the first test. Now, they didn't do quite as many in the second one because they had fewer questions, but 30 individual t-tests is not, and I'm surprised. I don't know why they did it that way, and it shocks me a little bit. But the results were fairly overwhelmingly, significant. So,
in philosophy, we would say that, generally speaking, that proof is restricted to abstract certainties, logical connections, right? So, you can't really prove anything in the concrete.
Right. So again, I mean, they have all they've got their, correlations, and they've got they've got everything here. But again, so not only did they do 30 single sample t-tests, but they also did all of these, they tested the significance of all these correlations. So over and over and over again, we have, and there's plenty that are non-significant. There are some, but it makes you wonder if maybe some of the ones that are significant were not. And in study 2, the differences were smaller. So, it does make one wonder. So, the other thing that they found was that people generally who women were more censorious in study 2, and they did, again, sort of rate the harm as a little bit higher. They can't really explain why that didn't happen in study one. And generally speaking, people who found the results of studies more confusing also rated them as likely more harmful. So people who didn't understand what they read as well sort of defaulted to it's more harmful and less helpful. So I think that's really interesting because that has to do with science communication, right? If we're not doing a good job of communicating science, then maybe people are, a little more afraid of it. And there was a tendency basically just for people who admittedly um, thought that they, in the survey admitted or, endorsed that the idea of they softened the censorship thing, but essentially endorsed censorship to say that not everything should always get published. There should be guidelines. Those were also people who were more censorious in their evaluations. So we do have a little bit of a trait thing going on there where we have people who already think that, it's not everything goes, like we really should put limits on these things, are going to be the ones who then find reasons to limit things. And we actually did a podcast on, like how people attend to different things in the environment, right? According to their existing ideology there. And that makes sense. We find evidence in the environment that matches our attitudes. So people who had those attitudes that generally we shouldn't just publish anything, things should, be looked at, were also more censorious. So the main reason I wanted to do this article is because I think that it's worth discussing how typical it is for people to be sort of advocating for censorship, fighting the good fight for someone else, demonstrating how virtuous they are, maybe because they want, by saying, "Oh, you don't understand. You're harming them over there, and look at me taking care of them." You know, and that's why I think that this is an interesting article. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but I do think it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, methodological issues notwithstanding, I mean, I found it interesting as well. Some of the findings that they brought up. Okay, so we got three kind of findings here. So they found the potentially moderating effects of political ideology and perceived offensiveness on half overestimations. They found that conservatives were more likely to do that, and I'm going to take issue with that. So that's something I want to take issue with too.
Well, I think. Well, so let's hold that because you wrote those down, right? You wrote three, so we can talk about this one for a minute. So I was kind of surprised by this at first because I really did. So just the same way that they expected women to be more censorious, I expected liberals to be more censorious, honestly. So I was a little bit surprised, and then I realized, well, we do have pretty strong, sort of book banning and that kind of stuff coming from the right. And these are so anyway, I don't know.
No, I mean, so you can probably predict what I'm going to say here, right? It doesn't surprise me that people who call themselves conservatives are more censorious than people who call themselves liberal. My issue would be, are these people really conservatives? Because I don't think that they are. There's a confusion between ideology and attitude, right? So the article talks about ideology. It says people who hold to a conservative ideology. Well, how did you test that?
Well, that's the thing, is like you have to, everything that's survey related, you're reliant on people to, I mean, we're not testing it, right? You're just asking people to self-report. Now, here's the thing that I will say about this, though, is that they did have across two studies, they have like 1,500 people in the study, across two studies. And look, people will people on the left and people on the right, as people think about their ideology, obviously everyone's going to have we're all going to have individual differences in that. And the idea behind science is that those individual differences through random assignment are spread evenly. Okay. So we do call this error in our study. This is a different kind of error than the error that I was talking about with t-tests. This is just error within groups, within individuals. Okay. So we can never control that. And so the way that we compensate for this idea that we can never control it by doing these statistical analyses, knowing that we can never control for people's individual differences and thoughts about even evaluating their own conservativeness or liberalness or whatever. And so that is spread throughout the study. So there's equal amounts of error in terms of whether you're a conservative or not, as there is error in whether you're a liberal or not. So that individual differences evens itself out because it's spread randomly throughout the entire study. And so statistically, it is controlled for. So I understand but we are never looking at an individual's response. Never. We never look at one individual's response. We look at hundreds of people's responses compared to hundreds of other people's responses. So you do the best you can, and you accept that error, and you use they did not, in my opinion, but you use your statistics in order to ensure that that you've covered yourself for that. That's why they pre-registered their study. They knew how many people that they needed in their study in order to cover for error.
I'm not sure that you can cover for it because...
Well, of course you can. You can statistically. You can statistically, but you cannot ever.
No.
Your argument is based on a single individual in a study and how they're answering a question. You're trying to get into the head of a single person. You have to give up on that in order to do research.
If I
like this.
Yeah, you could control for things like this. It would just be a lot harder. For example, you could have a survey which required people to ask a series of questions which gauged how liberal they are. But
there would be error in those
you might say that
too.
Okay, fine, but I mean, the philosophical error here in this article is so glaring that like stuff like this just makes me like for fuck's sake. People. How
many questions would satisfy?
Well, just let me get this idea out of my head first, and then we'll go on to the weird statistical stuff that I know nothing about. There is an assumption in this article, a kind of a suppressed assumption that liberalism and conservatism exist on a scale, right? So you've got conservatism here and liberalism here, and it's just wrong. It's just out and out wrong.
I'm asking you though, how would you fix that?
Well, I would test for something that is easier to test for example, authoritarianism.
There are measures of authoritarianism, and we've discussed those, and you haven't liked those either. I have read off the questions. You haven't liked those.
I like them more than conservatism versus liberalism. No, because you can't. Like the whole point of conservatism, as it was initially conceived of, and how it is conceived of by pretty much any significant conservative philosopher, was to conserve liberalism. It is in defense of liberalism, not in opposition to it.
The point isn't the philosophical definition of liberalism. The point is, where do people think that they are?
No, I get that, but can we just have somebody say that? It's not hard to say that. You've just said
maybe
that.
maybe not, but in this,
you can make this whole kind of
in the terms of the study, what would be the point of saying, okay, we're using this measure of liberalism and conservatism, but it's meaningless? What would be the point?
You don't need to say it's meaningless. No, but you don't need to say it's meaningless, right? So you can make now I'm going to put my linguistics hat on, right? So from a linguistics point of view, you would talk about the definition of a word in two ways, right? number one would be descriptive, and number one would be prescriptive, and number two would be descriptive, right? So when I'm arguing these people aren't really conservatives, I'm talking prescriptive meaning, right? I'm saying here is a body of literature on conservative thought that was made in order to defend liberalism. Therefore, you cannot say it's at odds with liberalism because it is inherently liberal. Like, that's the whole point of it. But on the other hand, you could kind of push back on that, and you could say, well, from a descriptive point of view, all of that's wonderful, and I might even agree with you. But from a descriptive point of view, this is how the word conservative is used, and whether you like it or not, that's just the reality. And I'm fine with that, you know. But can we say that? Because I think that these philosophical differences and these philosophical distinctions are not unimportant. It is not unimportant, for example, that we have loads of people going around calling themselves liberal who are acting in very authoritarian ways. It's not an unimportant issue.
It's not, but it's also not the point of this article.
No, but it may not be. But if you're going to start talking about conservatism and liberalism, you need to make it clear what you mean by those things.
So,
and I don't feel that they did.
Well, I don't disagree with you. I will say this though, they were not making a political point.
I get
at
that.
all in this
I get
study.
That.
They knew that if they didn't ask this question, and if they didn't balance things out by finding some things that they thought would be particularly offensive to, say, the left, for lack of a better term, and the right, and then have a couple of things that they would be criticized for saying, well, you didn't ask about people's political leanings, and so your study's worthless. So they did that. Their main focus was simply that people would overestimate other people's ideas about what would be harmful, that they would assume that other people would think things were more harmful. They only looked at political ideology because they knew that they would be criticized if
but they didn't look at political ideology.
No, that's what I'm saying.
That's the problem. They said they threw that ideologically conservative. That's just wrong.
Okay.
No, you could say attitudinally conservative, maybe, but it's not ideologically conservative because it just isn't. That's not.
But it's
wrong.
I just don't see it. Yeah, it's a philosophic. This isn't a philosophy paper. It's it's a psychology.
I get that, but when you're going to start
and there's
to use
just no way around
term,
it. When you're already asking people, look, they had to pay these people, right?
They're
already asking them a bunch of questions, and the scales of authoritarianism are so obvious that it's very difficult to use them. They're just blatantly obvious. I mean, it's essentially the equivalent of asking, so are you
up for putting somebody up against the wall at a gunpoint?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's so, and the only people who are going to answer in the affirmative to those are people who have very extreme views and essentially don't care. So what you have is a very small number of people who are answering in the affirmative. So anyway, so go on to your next one. So
we've had our little dispute. No, we have a little dispute, but there is a solution to this, and there is a footnote, paying, this is a problem, and if you want to read about it, go here, right? Just at least acknowledge that it's an issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think that from my perspective, the people who are usually reading these articles are psychologists, and that footnote's not necessary because it's just a given.
But these psychologists don't understand political ideology.
We accept the flaws in our questions. No, and this is why we never just accept this is one of many reasons why we never say research is done, because there are different ways.
No, but they don't accept the flaws in their questions, psychologists, and that the reason, the evidence I would give you for them not accepting the flaw in their questions is the extent to which social psychology and social psychological institutions have been captured. Right? If they knew the
Okay.
flaw in their
So
ideology, then
it's
they
it's
wouldn't have been captured
you're
as much
saying
as that.
they, and I'm saying
I'm
we,
saying
and
those.
so
I'm
so
saying those people who have allowed for the psychological institutions to be captured. That's not a kind
yeah.
of
No, I'm
conspiratorial
saying
they, right?
I'm saying in our research, we accept that there are going to be flaws in the way that we have asked certain questions, knowing that if we have 1,000 people in our study or more, that people are going to misunderstand. It doesn't matter what question you ask them. There are going to be
Sure.
people who misunderstand things, and there are certainly ways to write better questions. But
Right.
there's just no way around. There's no perfect survey, and
No.
including an authoritarianism scale. And I, what, I didn't go to the supplementary. I did look at it. I don't know what their preliminary study was. They did a pre-study to test some of their questions and stuff. So but this is a very
I
typical question, and the fact that you don't like it
sure,
does not
but
negate the importance
no, no,
of the
no.
research.
But no, I'm not trying to negate the importance of the research. By the way, I'm just simply identifying an issue, right? That I think people could do a better job on, because I think that ideological illiteracy in social psychology is a massive issue, and I think this is an example of it. Personally, that doesn't, that criticism doesn't mean I'm throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But I constantly come up against this problem
And
when we're
that
going
is a
through these.
criticism, by the way, that is, like, because Ilana Redstone is on the list, that is something that, we might have expected, you might have expected from her.
Well, Tetlock as
You
well.
would have, yeah, yeah.
Well, Tetlock.
Okay,
Well,
moving on to number two.
okay,
We
moving
could,
on to number two. Whether people evaluate offensive scientific findings as incomprehensible. So
yeah.
here's the question: do they find it offensive because it's incomprehensible, or do they decide that it's incomprehensible because they find it offensive?
Yeah, that's another research question, right? They can't answer that. All they can do is say that there's a correlation here between what people say is, incomprehensible research and their event that, and then their ratings that it's, likely to be more harmful and less helpful. So I, again, as I mentioned, like, I think that's important just for, science communication. That should be, further studied. If people are having, and I do think, I mean, most likely, I'm not in advertising, so I don't, I can't say too much about. I'm sure advertising research has looked into this in terms of how easily understood a message is and that kind of stuff. And certainly, there's plenty of social psychological research on, the messenger, the message, and how, um, you know how convincing an article is. I'm sorry, how convincing an argument is, has lots of different aspects. Um, so I don't, but I don't know what I don't know. So we know about, there's plenty of advertising and sort of compliance and research on how to get people to accept your message, short term and longer term. Um, but what I don't know is how much research there is in sort of science communication. I do know that there's been other articles in, like, Nature and stuff about this problem that, you know, especially even more so now that we have the whole vaccine, um, you know, vaccine problem. um, so that we need to do a better job with science communication. So I do think that's I don't think they don't even bother really to try to explain that. They just say there's a correlation, there's a relationship there.
Yeah. What do you think, anecdotally?
I mean, yeah, well, yeah. So I mean, my gut feeling, if I were going to do a study, I guess
Mhm.
my next study would, a follow up to this, would be to manipulate the ease with which someone could understand. So, and how would you do that? Well, it's, you do one of those Flush Kincaid, reading level things, and you have one at a third grade level and you have one at a 12th grade level, right? And you have people read them. Is that perfect? No. You have people maybe communicate to each other, almost like the telephone game.
Mhm.
You could do a little
Or
telephone game
Chinese
thing, and
whispers. We
yes,
call it
Chinese
Chinese
whispers.
whispers.
Yeah. So
I
something
don't know
like
if we
that.
still call it Chinese whispers, but
Yeah,
we used
I
to
had
call
never
it
heard
Chinese
that.
whispers. Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
had never heard that. But some version of that where you have people sort of rephrase or something like that, and to see, instead of just people rating like, oh, you know, this wasn't as wasn't as clear to me or whatever. But I think your point is well taken, that the another hypothesis, that so you do that one, right, where you actually manipulate the ease, the sort of ratings of how easy it is, experimenter ratings of how easy something is to understand. But then the flip side is also true, right? Where if it's something that you would tend not to want to believe, would you
Right.
say it's less comprehensible? And we actually did do a podcast on that, right? Where
Hmm.
gosh, I don't even know, it was probably released in the summer, where people did, when something, they let's see if I can say this semi comprehensively. They resorted to unscientific arguments for why something that they didn't agree with didn't matter. So they didn't argue against the scientific finding in that um, study that we
Looked at, yeah.
reviewed. What they did was they said, well, it doesn't matter because it's just who I am, or it's just how I believe. And so it doesn't really matter if science, I don't know, I think one of them wasn't the thing that they um, had found evidence that, like, Noah's Ark really wasn't Noah's Ark. Wasn't that the one where I said I had
Can't
never heard
remember.
of that before? Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, and people were like, well, it doesn't really matter that scientifically this is demonstrated, because it's just part of my belief system, and my belief system
Mm.
is more important to me than any scientific finding. So that's a little hint at what you're talking about, which is,
Mm.
oh, well, if it's something that I don't particularly like, then maybe I would rate it as less comprehensible. So
Yeah.
I don't like it, it's less comprehensible, I would want to see more. And certainly those kinds of arguments, I think, have been used against both of us, which is, well, if gee, I might back you up, uh, but I don't know enough. Like they're cowards in that way. Like, oh, I don't know enough, so I can't possibly, speak out against, this, or speak up against maybe DEI training or something like that. 'Cause I don't know. I don't know enough. It's too confusing for me. I don't know enough
Hmm.
about how people might react, and so I just need to stay out of it. So I think there's hints in society, and this correlation. You can't know, right, which variable
It's really
is
interesting
causing the
because
other.
Immanuel Kant encountered this problem about, like, why is it that people don't become intellectuals? Why is it that there are so many obviously really intelligent people, but they don't really learn anything, or they don't? And what he's saying is that they're so afraid of being wrong or going out there or having their beliefs refuted, that they never bother, and their whole curiosity is completely curtailed. And what Kant says is, look, only just once you fell off your horse,
Yeah.
and then you dusted yourself off, and you realized that actually it wasn't so bad after all, and that you should allow other people to fall off their horses as well, because it happened to him, right? He'd gone out there and tried to have debates with people and being found to be wrong, and then realized that, well, no, I can dust myself off and I can be wrong again, and then eventually become a very great philosopher, which he was and was recognized as by the end of his life. um
Yeah,
yeah,
so
I mean,
what would be the harm if we twist this around, sort of
mm,
like like the fall off the horse thing? Like, what would be the harm in the idea that people can recover long term from child sex abuse?
wouldn't that
That
be a
there would
good
be,
thing?
Right. So it's not to say that it shouldn't be a crime. It's not to say that
No,
you
of course
know,
not.
no. However,
It,
just
it
the
is rendered
idea
no
that
it is rendered no
people,
less vicious and horrible and ghastly, irrespective of how
right,
bad the consequences are. That you're not saying anything about the consequences.
right.
You're not saying
That
anything about the original sin.
it's a hopeful thing that people can recover and live quality lives and go on to, have good relationships or whatever. And the same would be true, if we found that, police were not as racially biased as many
What
people
was
are
that?
invested in thinking. What would be the harm in finding that
Well,
out?
well,
That
well,
doesn't mean that there aren't inequalities. It doesn't mean
no.
that, that, but maybe the inequalities aren't because of police bias. And so
Right.
wouldn't it be valuable to
Well,
focus our energies, our money, our
right.
attention on a different aspect of it?
Can I just let even more, right? Okay, so let's say I am to invest you with godlike powers. Okay, you now have the ability to shape reality, and but you can't change reality that has already happened, right? You get your powers right now. Everything that's past is done, right? But you now have powers to change reality, going in the present and going forward. So you have two potential outcomes. Outcome number one is that the children who have been sexually abused grow up to be absolutely tormented and cannot live productive lives because of the horrors that they've been subjected to. Or that's outcome number one. Or outcome number two, um, most of them come to terms with it and lead happy and productive lives irrespective of what they've suffered. Which one do you go for?
Exactly. I mean, clearly number two, right? Like,
Right?
who wouldn't?
Well,
So
who wouldn't? But you're
why
not
are
saying anything about the horror of the crime,
right,
right?
right,
It doesn't, just thank
right,
goodness these children go on to become healthy adults. Thank goodness. It's not saying anything about how horrible the crime is. Nothing
right.
at all.
And so I do think, and I think that's one of the things that we kind of push, we try here to push back against, with regards to some of the DEI initiatives.
Mm.
There's, every, mispronouncing someone's name is not always a traumatic event.
No, it's almost
They
never a traumatic event. And if
exactly.
somebody does it, and if you are the kind of person that is traumatized by somebody mispronouncing your name, then the issue, I'm sorry, is with you.
Is likely you, yes. So
Like
what? So why?
I was
What is the
talking to
investment? So are we so invested in that, in microaggressions and all that kind of stuff? Are we so invested in that then that we render research suggesting that that people aren't harmed, by occasional, screw ups, um, that we would render that not understandable, right? That research didn't make sense to me, so yeah, I mean, I think that that would be a really interesting uh, study. So,
I mean, it seems to make sense, doesn't it? Like like
well, it's a
on
defensive mechanism, right? And so it's like, oh yeah, I did read something about that, but it just didn't make sense to me. So I'm
no,
not sure if I can,
but rhetorically, I mean, I've been in debates with people where somebody will say, "Oh, I don't understand what you mean by that," as a
yeah,
means to kind of like shutting down the debate. And they're like, "No, you
yeah,
understand exactly what I mean by that."
yeah,
And you're trying to shut the debate off. I mean, it's a very very strange thing, isn't it, that people want the worst consequences to be true, and that they think by wanting the worst consequences to be true, they are somehow morally superior.
yeah, yeah. That's
It's
very
it's
sad.
it's fucked up, to put it
Yeah.
mildly.
And it again, in terms of some of the things that we talk about here and some of the guests that we talked about, it also it it infantilizes people, right? It's like, oh, they can't, those, we're just, it's another way of dividing people into, people that can think for themselves and people who, people who are struggling. It's like those struggling people, we know they're, you know, they're a miserable lot, and
They're
they can't
doomed.
yeah, they're doomed,
They're
and
doomed.
so, and why are we so invested in thinking that? And
It's
why would we why would we invest so much energy in ensuring that that group of people feels that way about themselves, except to actually reduce their power, right? This is not an empowering ideology. This is a disempowering one, you know.
Okay, I'm going to use a psychological term, but I'm going to just put a warning up that I haven't got the faintest idea what I'm talking about, and I'm probably getting it completely wrong.
In terms of the actual term.
In terms of the actual term, I'm going to go back to descriptive and prescriptive language. This is how it's used descriptively, right, this term. But I'm aware that it points to a body of psychological literature that I might be just completely messing up. But it's almost like Munchausen by proxy. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right, so this kind of pathological, we must take care of these people, we must take care of them, while actually we're poisoning them, or actually we're harming them.
So we have to give ourselves something to take care of.
Right.
So
So I mean, the example I can think of is a friend of mine who is from America, and he's an academic in Japan. And I think as a teenager, he was a Hispanic gang member. Right, and bright guy, but he was involved in all these kind of this gang violence and stuff like that. And he recalls like his experience of the education system, as he was justifying it to me, was that people were constantly telling him, oh, well-meaning white middle-class women, largely women, he said, which would make sense, right? Because teachers are usually female in the education system, I think, more often than not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying that they were basically telling him, oh, isn't it awful, all of the racism that you're constantly being subjected to, and, it's terrible, and you can never make a go out of things for yourself. And then when he got into college and he realized that, he was comparing his papers that he was writing, and he was comparing his papers that he wrote to his white friends. And he realized that his papers weren't as good as his white friends' papers were, but he was getting higher marks than them. And he recognized this as all being extremely destructive, and extremely counterproductive, and he thought that had held him back, and that if people had have said, okay, well, maybe racism is an issue, but fuck that, you've got to just soldier on through and make a go of things, he thinks that would have been way better for him as a kid, and he believes that this is one of the primary things that is driving inequality, is this kind of, for lack of a better term, Munchausen by proxy. So there we are.
What's your point 3? What's
point
your
3?
Point number 3?
Are women more censorious than men?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we have yes in study 2,
Mm-hmm.
right, and a no in study 1, and they offer no explanation for. I mean, they had hypothesized that women would be. Women weren't in study 1, but they were in study 2. It could honestly, it could be because of their voluminous t-tests. He found it in study 2. It could be an error, right? It could be, what's called a type 1 error. So it may be that there's no actual effect in study 2 either. It's just a fluke. But anyway, so, I mean, I think probably when you read this, your gut instinct would have been that women would be, right? So I was kind of surprised when they weren't. But you know what? The research, there's something called the file drawer problem. I may have talked about the file drawer problem before, but the idea is that research that finds no significant differences doesn't tend to get published. There is actually a journal called the Journal of Null Effects, where people can, there is, because people have trouble, it's like, it's important to know when you find no effect. And the most common no effect is gender. The most common no effect is gender. So why we constantly push for, there's a difference. There's got to be a difference. There's got to be a difference. And most of the time we don't find a difference. But what happens is when there is a difference, that gets published. So I think that we push that, pretty hard, and we're always testing for it. And if you think about the millions and millions of times that researchers have tested for a gender difference, and you think about the inflation of alpha over across all of those studies, you're going to occasionally find a difference, right? It's going to happen. And so, maybe this just isn't the kind of thing that you really, when it's this controlled, when it's not, think about in a classroom, maybe in sort of a real scenario, maybe you would find that women were more interested in protecting or, hovering or mothering or whatever, nurturing, protecting someone from harm of some kind or another. But on paper, in this kind of a study where people are just ranking things, maybe you just wouldn't. So
Interesting. I'm going to go anecdotal again. In my experience, I find that American women are more censorious than men, but I find that Japanese women are less censorious than Japanese men, which is, I don't know, maybe a cultural thing, or maybe I'm just completely getting it wrong. No evidence backing this up. It's just anecdotal. But certainly in a classroom, Japanese women would be much more, generally speaking, much more willing to advance an opinion than male students would be. Male students in Japanese classrooms tend to be very shy and quiet, the women, whereas the women tend to be the ones that are outspoken and will offer opinions and things like that, which is kind of flipped in America generally, isn't that right?
You know what? My classes are so overwhelmingly female that I actually couldn't,
You couldn't,
psychology is, I really can't, psychology is overwhelmingly female right now. So, I just don't have that many. If I have 3 or 4 men in a class of, 15 or 20, it's like, ooh, it's like, wow, look, so yeah.
Are you sure Are you sure that's not a statistical error?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it's not. Because it's just becoming a female dominated field.
Has it always been that way?
No, it is not. No.
What's going on there?
I mean, I think that women are, as higher ed, opened up in general, I think women are attracted to pretty much statistically, they tend to be attracted to more service kinds of fields. And there's, we can think of lots of reasons why women might choose education. It offers some flexibility, some, summers or whatever, off, if you will. It's not really off, but, more flexibility. Women may be making choices based, partly on lifestyle. But they also have been socially encouraged to think about others and to be, to consider sort of nurturing kinds of things. They tend to get talked to in the home about, feelings, and they get told and can tell more family history. It's just those kinds of things that likely draw them to fields like sociology, psychology, and social work and those kinds of things. So I think that's, I think it's just sort of the natural course of things. But, things like banking, for example, used to be all male and are now, much more female oriented. I mean, it's not at the lower levels, especially. So, I think it's just things ebb and flow.
And I guess higher education in general is becoming increasingly female dominated in terms of performance. Men tend to drop out earlier. Yeah. It doesn't help when you're being told that you're an evil cis white male.
Well, and frankly, just the attitudes about higher ed right now are, not that great.
No.
So,
Deservedly so, in my opinion.
Yeah, perhaps, yes. So, did you have any other, or were those your main 3?
Those were my main 3. How about you? Do you have anything other to add?
No, not really. I mean, I guess again, like I wanted to talk about this because I think that it confirms what we see and what we're constantly sort of complaining about anecdotally, which is that we don't think people are being harmed by so much of this, and that the people who are crying foul so often are not even involved in the situation. They don't even necessarily know who these sort of fictitiously harmed people are. They're just sort of in the ether somewhere,
Yeah.
those harmed people. And so I just liked it that there's a little bit of scientific evidence to what we have been anecdotally reporting. So
Yeah, and I would go further than that. It's not just that these people are not being harmed in the way or to the extent that their self-appointed champions allege they are, but that the self-appointed champions are actually harming people whom they're pretending to be standing
right.
up on behalf of. That it is a kind of Munchausen by proxy. Am I getting that right, by the way? Is that
You know what? I
you don't
again,
know?
well,
Yeah,
since I'm not clinical. Oh yes,
right,
your analogy is spot on.
right.
I just can't really speak to the clinical aspects of
Right.
Munchausen's. But your
So,
analogy makes perfect sense. Yeah.
I mean, like in Munchausen by proxy, I don't know, for example, if the person who is poisoning, I don't know, the child or the relative is doing it deliberately, or whether it's some kind of subconscious thing, or whether it's both of those things, whether they're two
Right.
variants of Munchausen by proxy. But I would suggest that those two variants are real in terms of how we are dealing with minorities, and be that gay people or black people or whatever. That there are people who buy into all of this ideology and genuinely believe that these people are being harmed, and therefore think that they're doing the right thing by exaggerating the harm that is being done to these people, and kind of trying to cocoon them, and then trapping them and stopping them from being able to go forward. Like, I think that there are those people who are generally not bad people. They're just wrong, and they're doing a
Right.
lot of harm by being wrong.
Well, yeah, and we've talked about the harm. I mean, because the title is harm hypervigilance,
Yeah,
but people also um, rated lower the helpfulness, positive outcomes of
right.
research, and and the suggesting that there be more research on this topic and that kind of stuff. So, how to what extent are we, you know, um, preventing more research from being done on a topic? Because we're saying, oh well, that's probably not going to be helpful. Let's focus on something else, like, and so so it isn't just the harm hypervigilance, but it's also the underestimation of potential benefits of
Right.
research. That's also
Well,
I mean, it's a double whammy, right? Squeezing from both sides.
I mean, why would anybody study Black Lives Matter?
Yeah. Yeah. Why would they?
Why would they?
Can't imagine.
Can't
And
imagine.
why? Yeah. Yeah. And because, and why wouldn't you study QAnon? And
Right.
it's like, well, you realize that I might have offended somebody who believes in QAnon, right? Oh, that's okay. That's You can offend them. We don't like them.
We don't like them. Yeah, but it's so puerile.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I mean, the base tribal loyalty is just. I don't understand why it's not so obvious. Look, I mean, like,
Well, even when you try to make it obvious. So this gets back to your question before, right? Even when you try to simplify the argument and make it more obvious,
they
they
still.
say they don't understand. We don't understand what
Okay.
you're saying.
Let's just pause, because we've got a real life example here, right? Okay. So you've got a series of priorities as a social psychologist, a psychologist, whatever, right? You can only study so many things, right? So as a social psychologist, I guess you are primarily interested in, there are lots of interesting things, but the thing that most people are going to gravitate to are the most consequential things in society, the most consequential issues in society, right? That's what you're going to go to first for most
Especially
social
when you have a
psychologists.
group, especially when your group is a group of undergraduates who are,
Right, because you're also trying
yeah,
to get the attention of the undergraduates. So
Yeah.
what are they interested
Yeah.
in? What are they thinking about? You know,
Yeah.
but then also on an abstract level, what is causing the biggest changes in society? So, you know, both of those goals are completely aligned, right? So, you know, in the last 10 years, the most significant social movement by far has been Black Lives Matter, clearly. And I don't think anybody would dispute that,
Right.
right?
It's
At
not
least
about
within the United
whether it's
States.
good or bad. It's just
Forget, yeah,
influential. Yeah.
yeah, that would be the most, like, so, you know, as a social psychologist, the most consequential thing is going to be what you want to study. But then, of course, you know, you want your students to be interested, and that's what they're likely interested in. So surely, on every single level, the first thing you would want to study as a sociologist, a psychologist, whatever, would be the Black Lives Matter movement. Then
Yeah. And
somebody can
to
say,
argue.
I
Yeah.
don't
And then
understand why you would
right.
want to. I'm sorry, like, are you brain dead? And the answer
Right.
is no. That's the thing. I mean, these academic, I mean, you know, I think academics tend to be dumber than most people some of the time. Someone's like, wow, that's so stupid, not even an academic would say that. But even for an academic, just for them to someone to turn around to you or anybody else and say, I don't understand why you would study Black Lives Matter. I mean, did you even think about what you said before that came out of your mouth?
Yeah.
I mean, and can you even stand by that? Can you stand by that and say, I said that, I think that was I said this, and, you know, because we all say stupid things, right? You know, you say, oh, I said
Yeah.
something completely
It's like,
stupid.
oh, wow. Yeah. I didn't
Sorry,
think of it that
I
way.
didn't think
Yeah.
I didn't think it through. I just said
Yeah.
something stupid. Even the most intelligent people make that mistake. So fair enough. I'm not suggesting being uncharitable. But can you actually say something like, I don't understand why you would do research on Black Lives Matter, and then let it stand, and not only let it stand, but actually think that that was an intelligent thing to say? Yeah, how can you say something like that? Again, being charitable, because people
Yeah.
make mistakes. How can you say something like that and not say, oh, I'm really embarrassed that I said something as obviously
Yeah.
stupid as that? And yet there are people who are standing by with that comment,
Oh, yeah.
apparently, and are allowed to
Yeah.
remain in positions of power.
Right.
And they should be absolutely ashamed of themselves.
They should be ashamed of themselves. Yes. And I think that I mean I'm glad that this article was published, especially in a journal that had fired their editor for,
Being
you know,
sensible,
potentially,
for being a
potentially
grown-up,
doing harm to some, unknown
ethereal,
person somewhere. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah, without even considering that actually, you know, the action that you are taking might also be doing harm as well.
Right.
And it's just this horrible hypocrisy. And here's the thing, and this is the thing that really leaves me scratching my head. How do these people not see it? Like, you know, we were talking with Will Riley about something kind of related. It's like, you know, we're looking at Ibram X. Kendi and people like that, and these obviously one-dimensional arguments, you know, sample size of one and all that nonsense. How do these people not see it? Are they really not seeing it? Or are they being
Well,
dishonest? And I'm
this
sure
gets
they're
back.
both, right?
Yeah.
There are some people
Well,
that
this gets back to, again, your point too, sort of this motivated hypocrisy, right? Where, or I'm sorry, this motivated reasoning to not recognize your own hypocrisies. So you're motivated to say, oh, something I don't agree with is not understandable. Something that I don't want to see my own hypocrisy. In fact, we're quite motivated to for consistency, right? We have this consistency bias, so we want to see ourselves as consistent. So we don't want to see ourselves. We're motivated to not see our own hypocrisies. So yeah, I mean that's basically what happens like with this Black Lives Matter thing. It's like this is why we see people just double down, right? On their own hypocrisy, and they do twist themselves into these knots, right? And other people can see them and see that, and yet they just we're just like, why would they do that? But they do it. So
I'll give you another example. Have you heard of The Acolyte?
Mm-mm.
So The Acolyte is the latest. It's not out yet, but it's due to be out soon is the latest mega big budget Star Wars television series.
Oh, yes. Okay. I didn't know the name of it, but I did know it was coming. Yes.
And basically the directors just said, yeah, there's no white men in it. Why would you have white men? Star Wars is largely followed by men. And probably in the West, most of them are white, and that's the big market. So, we're going to exclude all of them. And they've decided to make it like a black lesbian story.
Oh, okay.
Now, I've got no problem with black lesbian stories in space.
Right.
But
why does it have to
why
be
does it have to be
Star
Star
Wars?
Wars?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And if you want to have black lesbians in Star Wars, then that's great. But why are you making that the focus?
Right.
And they keep making this mistake with. And
Yes.
by the way, they keep making this, and it seems to be. And the worst thing is, like for me, it makes me resentful for Disney because I just want to see an old-fashioned Star Wars
Yes.
movie. Right, that's what I want to see because that's what resonates with me. And if the lead character is gay or whatever, then make it incidental, because your sexuality is incidental. Your gender is incidental, right?
Yes.
This is one of the massive successes of Western civilization, is because we made things like gender and sexuality incidental, and we should be proud about that. So if you're going to have a gay female lead, great, make it incidental. You don't. Oh, the oppression, the patriarchy. No.
Right.
But the problem is that it is drawing resentment from people.
Yeah.
And so it's actually because then people start to think, oh well, it's the gays that are pushing this message. No, it's not the gays are pushing this message, or it's women pushing. No, most of them are sick of it for all the same reasons you are, right?
Right.
But because of this kind of this tribal thinking that's coming on the right as well, or the new right, I should say. These programs are not only failing, they're actually causing more homophobia. Like, for example, we look at attitudes towards gays, beliefs in equality of gender and sexuality have been going up, and now recently they've been tracking down again, right? Because you're building resentment. So it's like, all of the evidence is there. Your programs are failing. Nobody is watching them. You're losing millions of dollars. You're trashing your company's stock price. And you are causing resentment, which is reinforcing exactly the kind of bigotries that you want to posture about being in opposition to. The evidence is not even, or should not even be, controversial. And yet, they double down.
This is what we've been, again, we've mentioned this several times in the podcast, but I do think that they're repeating what education has done over the last, let's just say slowly over the last 15 years, which is assume that their base, which would be, say rising, 8th graders. Okay. So like, that's, it's like, oh, those 8th graders, now they're about to enter high school and they're starting to think about college, and that they're always going to want to go to college. They're going to be driven by learning goals, actual knowledge, learning goals. Okay. And that is going to be, so, that's just there always. We're always going to have this, eager, hungry to learn group of people. Okay. So we can go off and do all these other missions. Okay. And, do initiatives and, all these kinds of other things. We don't need to pay attention to that. Our core, we don't need to pay attention to, because the core will always be there. No worries. Right. But this, and that is not what's happened. Right. So once, they've prostituted us, essentially, we can't claim that we're pure again anymore, right? We are now impure. We are not focused on the goals that we should be. We have students who are, more interested in grades than they are, learning. And we have AI, we have all kinds of problems. Okay. that were just, it's like we didn't think we had to pay attention to this. And now we see this in the movie industry. It's like, oh, that core, anybody who loves Star Wars, they'll come to a Star Wars movie. So we don't have to draw them. The people, we're going to do these other mission things that would be important to us. And those people will always come. No, guess what? They won't. They
No, they
won't.
won't.
And so we should be learning from this.
No,
Look around.
but it's even worse than that, right? Because it's not just like they've ignored their core. They've actually insulted their core, right? So
Yeah.
the core doesn't turn up for the Acolyte. I'm not going to watch the Acolyte, right? And the reason I'm not going to watch the Acolyte is not because it has lesbians or black lesbians in it. The reason I'm not going to watch the Acolyte is because it's not a Star Wars show.
Right.
I don't want to watch a Star Wars show with the hero, and the hero, by the way, can be a black lesbian if you like. But I want to see if it's going to be a black lesbian. I want to see her fighting Sith and all the rest of it. And they completely subverted that. It's not about that. Apparently, they're going around the heroes are killing Jedis now, and you're insulting your base. Did you see what they did to Luke Skywalker in the sequel trilogy?
No, I think I know this, and yet I can't recall.
You remember the original 3 movies from I think it was 79 to the early 80s, right? You remember those?
Yes.
So, A New Hope, and The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, right? And it's kind of like the redemptive arc of Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker being a kind of salvation figure. In the movies, Luke Skywalker's given up on life. He's like a homeless person living on this planet. And he's just a complete dropout and loser.
Yeah.
That's not what anybody. That's not what anybody wanted to see.
He's worse than Fat Thor.
Yeah, he's worse because he's completely given up.
Yeah.
It's just like nobody wanted it. That's not Luke Skywalker.
I didn't even want to see Fat Thor.
I didn't see Fat Thor.
No.
I just no. And then they make Thor a woman as well. Did you see that?
I know. Yeah. And the whole Hulk thing, making the She-Hulk thing, where the first thing that happened was that the female Hulk had to beat the real Hulk in order. It's like, no, that would never happen. Sorry. No.
But here's the thing. This is what I mean. Is you're creating.
And they didn't need to do that. They did not need to do that.
Didn't need to do that at all.
There's room in the world to have her and him.
People keep telling me when I say I make arguments like this, it's because you're against female empowerment. I'm like, in the early 2000s, I had the complete set of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? The complete Buffy the Vampire Slayer set. I had a huge crush on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? I thought she was amazing. I loved it. I played all of the Tomb Raider video games. I played all of them. Love all of them.
Oh, yeah, the Tomb Raider, yeah.
None of them were weak females. I even didn't mind
Wonder
when they
Woman.
gender.
I'm sorry, that
Wonder Woman.
The whole Wonder Woman. Oh, that's awesome.
I didn't even mind when they gender swapped Starbuck. Did you see the Battlestar Galactica series?
Yeah.
It wasn't really a gender swap because that was kind of sat later. So I kind of, but whatever. It was like a Katie Sackhoff, who was like, she was a kind of tomboy in the role, and I thought she was wonderful. Yeah. I loved it, absolutely adored it. I don't know if you saw it, but all of these things, you have this pattern. We've achieved this point where guys like me will enthusiastically play Tomb Raider and have no problem with it. And these games are massive successes, and now people are turning against it because they're being told that they're sexist. Right. It wasn't fucking sexist. Otherwise, this game wouldn't have been a huge success. Battlestar Galactica wouldn't have been a huge success. Buffy the Vampire Slayer wouldn't have been a huge success. I mean, you try and have Buffy the Vampire Slayer and play that to an audience in Saudi Arabia, it probably won't go down well because they genuinely are sexist. But the fact that these things are massive successes shows that your audience is not sexist. But no. I don't know. Why is it not obvious? I mean, and that's, I guess, what we have to end this on, right? Why is it not obvious?
Well, luckily we have research. I mean, a few people will read this, and maybe a few of them they'll tell 2 friends, and maybe they'll pass it on or whatever. And, we start to, sort of foment the idea that, that we may be hypervigilant to harm.
Here's a question I want to end on, right? Because I think that it's really important. I know that you can't answer this question confidently because there is just no evidence for this, right? So we get that people are hypervigilant to harm in terms of, Black Lives Matter, even not just even investigating Black Lives Matter, or
Yes.
the potential that, kids who have been horribly abused nevertheless can grow up to have healthy and productive lives. We get that all of that is obvious to us, and it's a great thing, right? That people who have been abused can have happy lives, and that police aren't hunting Black people. Like, those are both two extreme positive things, and we know that the evidence shows that to be true. So we should say that this is obvious. But what is it that this kind of denial of reality? We know that people seem to be denying reality in order to posture as being morally superior, right? That seems to be the effect. And I know you can't answer this question. How much of it is cynical, right? I get that some of it must be cynical and some of it must be innocent. But how much of it is cynical? And I say this because, again, these academics are not idiots. These journalists are not idiots, right? My gut reaction is to say that it is cynical, right? That these people are harming people and they know they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, most of them, knowing that some of them will not be cynical, but I think a lot of them are cynical, and I think even maybe most of them are cynical. Again, I can't say that with any confidence, and it's not even something we could research, right? Unless we had a kind of telepathy machine. But what's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I think that I would say people are even in denial about their own cynicism, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if we can get to, I think you're right. Like, I don't know that we could even get to it because I don't know how we could. We would have to, well, so it would be a fun psychology study to, to essentially, I mean, researchers do trick people into, revealing even to themselves their own hypocrisies and their own cynicism. So I suppose it could be done. But yeah, I think that, the I think people are blind to their own cynicism, and they would. I think that others have hypothesized that also, that that one of the motivations is, that you get both. You get to have your cynicism and your virtue too. So.
I don't know. I don't understand how these people are not, like, profoundly ashamed of themselves. But then, I'm assuming cynicism, right? I'm assuming that they
I
are
think many
capable of
people
looking at
aren't
themselves in the
as
mirror.
Yeah, I think many people don't look at themselves in the mirror. I think many people are not as self-reflective as we are. And I do think that's one of the reasons why you and I spend time together, and why we've been, drawn to ILV and before that counterweight, because these are the conversations that we longed for, right? And we are getting less of it over time. And so, and I do think that's partly because people are not, they're not engaged even with their own cynicism or hypocrisy, or so. I find it fascinating when I recognize my own hypocrisy. I'm like, whoa,
Yes.
what's this about? And I
Yeah,
want to
like
look at it and think about it. And sometimes I just want to honor it and say, well, I guess I'm just going to have that.
Yeah,
I have a couple that I've just accepted in myself.
The great example
like,
you gave me.
that's it.
The great example you gave me was, if a pregnant mother is killed by a drunk driver or something like that, right? You would say that's two lives. But then you said you were pro-choice,
Yes.
which is, there is some tension
Right.
there, right, between those 2 points of view.
Can't explain it, and I just have decided. I have thought a long time about this. So I realized when I felt that way. I remember the time when I became aware. acutely aware of that. And it was in 2001. So I mean, I've thought about this for more than 20 years. And
Okay.
so I cannot answer, I can't come up with a reason. There's nothing that will satisfy this. So I just accept that I have hypocritical thoughts and feelings about
Here's
that. And I still find it fascinating.
here's one of mine. Doing trans surgery, transgender transitioning surgery on children. Like initially, like my reaction is this is completely a priori wrong and you should never do that. Like out, completely no. But then it must have been a good decision some of the time, because some of those children who didn't get the surgery will then go on to be trans adults and get it, right? And then be happy.
Right.
There's an inconsistency there too.
Yeah.
Right? And again, I think we all have them, but we've got to try and be aware of our biases, and we're never going to be aware of all of our biases, of course, we know that, right? But for fuck's sake, if you are a social psychologist, right, you should at least have a go. At least have a go. And if you're a social psychologist and you say something like, I don't see why anybody would want to study Black Lives Matter, and you can't even have a go at that point, then I'm sorry, you have no business calling yourself a social psychologist or a philosopher or a sociologist or even really an academic. I mean, maybe if you're a mathematician and you can't see the reason for that and you're just, okay, I can kind of get that. You're just over somewhere else and that has nothing to do with what you're occupying your mind with. Fine, fair enough.
They literally said that out of the blue, not, just,
yeah. So it isn't obvious, apparently, which is unbelievable. And on that cheering note, thank you very much. Yes.